Chapter 5. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, John A. Sanford. We can begin by contrasting the description of Henry Jekyll with that of Edward Hyde. We are told that Jekyll was a large, well-made, smooth-faced man of 50, with something of a stylish cast, perhaps, but every mark of capacity and kindness. So there is no reason to suppose that Jekyll did not have many good qualities. Only the hint of a stylish cast betrays the fact that hidden underneath the goodness of Henry Jekyll, there was a person of more doubtful character. Later, Jekyll describes himself in more detail as a man fond of the respect of the wise and good among my fellow men. This tells us that in addition to his natural store of goodness and kindness, Henry Jekyll had a desire for approbation by his fellows, and so struck by certain pose in front of mankind, that is, adopted a pleasing persona that would bring him the approval and respect of others. Jekyll noted another side to his personality, however, which was at variance with this persona, a certain impatient gaiety of disposition. This led him to seek certain pleasures in life which he found hard to reconcile with his imperious desire to carry his head high. Hence, Jekyll noted, he adopted a more than commonly grave countenance before the public. In other words, the grave countenance Jekyll publicly struck was a mask to shield from others another side to his personality that Jekyll did not want anyone to see, and which he regarded with a morbid sense of shame. As a consequence, Jekyll wrote, I concealed my pleasures and stood already committed to profound duplicity of life. Jekyll displayed psychological insight. He was aware of the duality of his own nature and declared that man is not truly one, but truly two. He could even hazard the conjecture that man is made up of a whole assortment of part selves, that his personality is not single, but is like a village of people, an insight modern depth psychology corroborates. He saw this duality as thorough and primitive, that is, archetypal, and therefore present from the beginning as a fundamental aspect of man's basic psychological structure. Armed with this kind of psychological insight into himself, Jekyll might have gone on to great heights of conscious development, but failed to do so because of a fundamental psychological error, as we shall see. Hyde is described as young, full of hellish energy, small and somehow deformed. He's a juggernaut, not like a man, a person who evoked hatred in others at the very sight of him. He has a black, sneering coldness and is capable of human feeling, and therefore is without any twinge of conscience, and so is incapable of guilt. Hyde's youthfulness suggests that, as the shadow personality of Jekyll, he contains unused energy. The shadow, as we have seen, includes the unlived life, and to touch upon the shadow personality is to receive an infusion of new, that is, youthful energy. Hyde's small size and deformed appearance indicates that, as the shadow personality, Hyde has not lived very much in Jekyll's outer life. Having dwelt for the most part in the darkness of the unconscious, he is deformed in appearance, like a tree forced to grow among the rocks and in the shadow of other trees. Hyde's lack of conscience, described by Jekyll as a solution of the bonds of obligation, is also characteristic of the shadow personality. It is as though the shadow leaves moral feelings and obligations up to the ego personality while he or she strives to live out of inner and forbidden impulses quite devoid of mitigating effects of a sense of right or wrong. But perhaps the most important thing we are told about Edward Hyde comes from Jekyll's comment that when he first was transformed by the drug into Hyde, I knew myself to be more wicked, tenfold more wicked, sold a slave to my original evil. At first, Jekyll has only seen in himself a certain gaiety of disposition, a pleasure-seeking side that might have led to mischief, but nothing more. But once he has become Hyde, he realizes he is far more evil than he ever supposed. From this description, it appears that the shadow personality begins with our personal dark side, but at some point contacts a deeper, more archetypal level of evil, which is so strong that Jekyll could say of Hyde that he alone among men was pure evil. In the hands of this archetypal evil, the pleasure-seeking mischief in which Jekyll wanted to engage soon led to truly satanic activity, as exemplified in the hellish murder of Dr. Carew, which was done for the pure joy of evil and destruction. We can see this same satanic quality emerging in those situations in which a person cold-bloodedly kills others, either in war or crime, without evident remorse. It is an archetypal evil that both shocks and fascinates us, and draws us with horrified absorption to the daily reading of our newspapers. C.G. Jung once wrote that we become what we do. This helps us understand even more the reason for Jekyll's demise. Once he decides to be Hyde, even if only for a while, he tends to become Hyde. He tends to become Hyde. The deliberate decision to do evil leads to our becoming evil. This is why living out the darkness impulses of the shadow cannot be a solution to the shadow problem, for we can easily become possessed by or absorbed into evil if we try such a thing. These attest to the archetypal nature of evil, for it is one of the qualities of the archetypes that they can possess the ego, which is like being devoured by or made identical with the archetype. Jekyll himself becomes aware of this danger after he finds himself involuntarily turning into Hyde. This was an enormous shock to him. He had expected to be able to move from Jekyll to Hyde and back again at will, but now he finds that Hyde is taking over. His former confidence, which led him to say, the moment I choose, I can be rid of Mr. Hyde, is now gone. This attitude shows a carelessness toward evil that predisposed Jekyll toward possession. It comes up again in the story, in the scene in which Jekyll sits in the park and reflects that he is, after all, like my neighbors, and compares himself favorably with other men, noting his active goodwill in contrast to the lazy neglect of others. Jekyll's careless disregard for the powers of evil, together with his desire to escape the tension of his dual nature, paves the way for his ultimate destruction. So, at this point in the story, Jekyll resolves to have nothing more to do with the Hyde part of his personality, and even declares to Utterson, oh, I swear to God, I will never set eyes on him again. I bind my honor to you that I am done with him in this world. It is all at an end. And Jekyll does try to have done with Hyde. He renews his old life, becomes more dedicated than ever to doing good works, and also, for the first time, becomes devoted to religion as well. We must assume that Jekyll's devotion to religion means that he went through formal religious observances, perhaps joining a church of some kind. We know, of course, that Jekyll's religion is not sincere. He knows nothing of God, but he's hoping to find in formalized religion and in his own religious pretensions a defense against being overcome by Hyde. No doubt many of us today are using religion in this way, especially those religious creeds that decry man's sins, threaten the sinful man with punishment, and encourage good deeds as the sign of salvation. This kind of religion tends to draw as members those persons who are consciously or unconsciously struggling to hold in check their shadow personalities. But the attempt does not work with Dr. Jekyll, and Hyde has now grown stronger within him. Hyde, as the shadow personality, continues to exist in the unconscious and is now, more than ever, struggling to be free, that is, to possess Jekyll's personality so he can live as he wants to. The dark side has been strengthened too much, and the attempt to hold him in check and keep him locked in the basement of the psyche fails because Hyde is now stronger than Jekyll. So Stevenson is telling us that if living out the shadow is not the answer, neither is the repression of the shadow the answer. For both leave the personality split in two. There is also Jekyll's insincerity and religious pretension. Both his religion and his desire to have nothing to do any longer with Hyde stem from his desire for self-preservation and not from his moral feelings. It is not for spiritual reasons, but because he fears destruction that Jekyll wants Hyde contained. Underneath, there still exists his unrecognized longing for evil, as is evidenced by the fact that even in the midst of this great resolve to have nothing to do with Hyde, he did not destroy Hyde's clothes or give up the apartment in Soho. We could say that at this point, the only way Jekyll could have kept from being overcome by evil was if his soul were filled with a spirit more powerful than that of evil. But in allowing himself to become Hyde, Jekyll emptied his soul and evil could take possession of him. Henry Jekyll's fundamental mistake was his desire to escape the tension of the opposites within him. As we have seen, he was gifted by a modicum of psychological consciousness, more and most men, for he knew that he had a dual nature. He was aware that there was another one in him whose desires were counter to his more usual desires for the approbation of mankind. Had he enlarged this consciousness and carried the tension of the opposites within him, it would have led to the development of his personality. In the language we have been using, he would have been individuated. But Jekyll chose instead to try to escape this tension by means of the transforming drug, so that he could be both Jekyll and Hyde, and have the pleasures and benefits of living out both sides of his personality without guilt or tension. For as Jekyll, it is worth nothing. He felt no responsibility for Hyde, for it was Hyde, after all, and Hyde alone that was guilty, he once declared. This gives us a clue to how the problem of the shadow can be met. What was Jekyll's failure may tell us where to go if the conclusion of our drama with a shadow is to be successful. Success may lie in carrying that tension which Jekyll refused. Both repression of the knowledge of the shadow and identification with a shadow are attempts to escape the tension of the opposites within ourselves, attempts to lose the bonds that hold together within us a light and dark side. The motive, of course, is to escape the pain of the problem. But if escaping the pain leads to psychological disaster, carrying the pain may give the possibility for wholeness. Carrying such a tension of the opposite is like a crucifixion. We must be as one suspended between the opposites, a painful state to bear. But in such a state of suspension, the grace of God is able to operate within us. The problem of our duality can never be resolved on the level of the ego. It permits no rational solution. But where there is consciousness of a problem, the self, The imago Dei within us can operate and bring about an irrational synthesis of the personality. To put it in another way, if we consciously carry the burden of the opposites in our nature, the secret irrational healing process that ego um, on in us unconsciously can operate to our benefit and work towards the synthesis of the personality. This irrational healing process, which finds a way around seemingly insurmountable obstacles, has a particularly feminine quality to it. It is the rational, logical, masculine mind that declares that opposite, like ego and shadow, light and dark, can never be united. However, the feminine spirit is capable of finding a synthesis where logic says none can be found. For this reason, it is worth noting that in Stevenson's story, the feminine figures are few and far between, and when they do occur, they are seen in an exclusively negative light. There is not one major character in the book who is a woman. Jekyll, Enfield, Utterson, Poole, the handwriting expert, Mr. Guest, Dr. Lanyon, all are men. The women figures have only brief mention. There is the woman who cared for Hyde's apartment, an evil-faced woman, cold and witch-like. There is a brief mention of the frightened maid whom Utterson meets when he goes to Jekyll's house on the final night, who is described as hysterically whimpering. There is, of course, also the little girl who was trampled on, and the women who grouped around Hyde, who were wild as harpies. Even Hyde in the laboratory, that final night, is described as weeping like a woman or a lost soul. The only vaguely positive allusion to a woman or to the feminine is the maid who witnessed the murder of Dr. Carew, but even she is said to have fainted at the sight. In short, the feminine comes off badly in Stevenson's story. It is cold and witch-like, weak and ineffective, or is victimized, which suggests that the feminine spirit was rendered inoperative and was unable to help in the situation. Translated into psychological language, we can say that when psychological consciousness is refused, as Jekyll had refused it, the feminine part of us, our very souls, weakens and languishes and falls into despair. A tragedy, for it is this very feminine power that can help find a way around what is otherwise an insoluble problem. A comment on Mr. Utterson is in order. The portrayal of Utterson is a testimony to the skill of Stevenson as a storyteller, for while the majority of the narrative is told to us through his eyes and experiences, he himself never intrudes into the spotlight. His character is adroitly drawn. We like Utterson. We can picture him in our minds. We can follow his thoughts and feelings and reactions. Yet the spotlight of the story always shines through him onto the central mystery of Jekyll and Hyde, so that Utterson never takes over the center of the stage. Because of this, we may be inclined simply to dismiss Utterson as a literary device, a necessary figure to have so that the story may be told, but not a character who is likely to have anything to teach us about the mystery of good and evil. But in fact, Utterson is more important than he seems, for he is the human figure whose sensibilities are aroused by evil and in whose consciousness the full story of good and evil, ego and shadow, finally emerges. He represents the human being who has a sufficiently strong feeling function that he is shocked by evil and can therefore resist being overcome by it. It is exactly this feeling function which enables a human being to react with horror at the depths of evil that was weak in Jekyll and totally lacking in Hyde. It is also necessary that evil eventually be known by someone. The doings of Jekyll and Hyde were a secret, but Secrets have a way of trying to emerge. Every secret is propelled by hidden inner forces toward human consciousness. And for this reason, evil deeds eventually emerge into the awareness of humanity in general, or someone in particular. Notice, for instance, that early in the story, Utterson's mind is tortured by and what he does not know, and he's unable to sleep. This is a sure sign that the unconscious is troubling Utterson and is seeking to find a way to bring into his consciousness the dreadful and dark secret life to Jekyll and Hyde. So in the story, it is Utterson whose consciousness becomes the container for the knowledge of evil. And thus, he represents the ego at its most human and best, a kind of redemptive person whose dawning awareness of what is happening and horrified feelings provide a human safeguard against the takeover of human life by the powers of darkness. But how about Dr. Lanyon? He too came to see the nature of evil, but in the wrong way. Lanyon had not sought out the mystery of Jekyll and Hyde as did Utterson, and when the full extent of the evil broke in on him, it was too much for him. He saw evil too quickly and looked into it too deeply without the necessary preparation or the necessary human support. And that is the other side of becoming conscious of evil. We must become aware of it, but to look into it too deeply and naively may give us a shock from which we cannot recover. The demonic drug that Jekyll concocted to achieve his transformation into Hyde is also worth a comment, especially in this present time of history when we are surrounded on all sides by drugs with mind-altering effects. I have often noted that in some instances at least, alcohol seems to change people from a Jekyll to a Hyde personality. A person in one way until he or she takes a few drinks and then out comes the ugly side of the personality. In certain cases, it may be well that at the bottom of the urge to drink is the struggle of the shadow to assert itself. Just as in our story, Hyde yearned for Jekyll to take the drug so he could live out his own dark life. We can also note that although the evil part of Jekyll's personality destroyed him, it also eventually destroyed itself. No sooner was Jekyll completely possessed by Hyde than Hyde himself died by suicide. This too is instructive, for it tells us that evil eventually overreaches itself and brings about its own destruction. Evidently, evil cannot live on its own, but it can exist only when there is something good upon which it can feed. I'm sorry about the noises. Alarms all over the place. The end of chapter 5.